The security camera footage showed them laughing as they dove into her pristine pool at 2 a.m., beer bottles glinting in the moonlight. Night after night, they violated her sanctuary while she lay awake, trembling with rage. But Sarah Chen wasn't. Just any homeowner, she was a former military intelligence officer who'd toppled governments with less provocation. They thought they were hunting a helpless widow. They had no idea they'd awakened a predator who'd been waiting 20 years to use her skills again. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the dark figures slip through the gap in her fence like shadows given form. 3 of them tonight, the same 3 who'd been trespassing for 2 weeks straight, turning her meticulously maintained backyard into their personal playground. The pool lights cast an ethereal blue glow across the water, illuminating their faces as they stripped down to their underwear. College kids from the looks of them, probably from the university 15 minutes away. The tall one with the buzz cut, she'd started thinking of him as Alpha, was already uncapping a beer with his teeth. His companions, a lanky redhead and a stocky brunette with tribal tattoos covering his shoulders, were setting up what looked like a Bluetooth speaker on her patio table. "Fucking entitled brats," Sarah whispered, her breath fogging the window. At 45, she'd thought she'd left this kind of violation behind. 20 years in military intelligence had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting, that sometimes the smart play was to retreat, regroup, and strike when your enemy least expected it. But this wasn't Afghanistan or Bosnia. This was her home. The sanctuary she'd built after David's death 3 years ago, the place where she was supposed to feel safe. Her fingers found the scar along her left shoulder blade, a souvenir from Kandahar that still ached when storms were coming. The doctors said it was phantom pain, that the shrapnel had been removed years ago. Sarah knew better. Some wounds never fully healed, especially when they reminded you of who you used to be. The music started, some bass-heavy rap that made her windows vibrate. Alpha was already in the pool, floating on his back like he owned the place. The redhead was filming everything on his phone, probably posting it to whatever social media platform was popular with sociopaths these days. Sarah had called the police 4 times. Officer Martinez was sympathetic but useless. "Without catching them in the act, ma'am, it's just trespassing. We'll increase patrols, but unless you want to press charges." Press charges. Right. Against. 3 kids whose parents probably had lawyers on speed dial, whose daddies probably wrote checks to the Police Benevolent Association. Sarah had seen how this played out before, in different countries with different rules but the same basic corruption. Money talked, and justice listened to whoever spoke loudest. She padded downstairs to the kitchen, bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Through the sliding glass door, she could see them more clearly. Alpha was doing laps now, his strokes aggressive and territorial. The tattooed one, she'd dubbed him Ink, was rifling through her outdoor storage cabinet, probably looking for pool toys or equipment to destroy. The redhead, Flame, her mind supplied automatically, the old habit of assigning operational codenames never fully abandoned, was still filming, but now he was focused on her house. Specifically, on the sliding door where she stood. Their eyes met through the glass. Flame grinned, raised his phone higher, and gave her a little wave. Sarah's vision went red around the edges. The same rage that had gotten her into trouble in Sarajevo, the fury that had made her too dangerous for active duty, came flooding back like water through a broken dam. Her hand moved instinctively to her hip, muscle memory searching for the Sig Sauer P226 that had been her constant companion for 2 decades. But she wasn't Captain Chen anymore. She was just Sarah, a widow who taught part-time at the community college and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. A woman who baked cookies for new neighbors and still set 2 plates for dinner, sometimes forgetting that David wouldn't be coming home. The phone in her pocket buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Nice house BTW. Love what you've done with the place. Mind if we use your hot tub next?" Sarah stared at the message, her hands shaking with suppressed violence. They had her number. They'd been watching her longer than she'd realized, learning her routines, her vulnerabilities. This wasn't random. Teenage mischief. This was psychological warfare. Another text. "Maybe we should meet properly. You look lonely in there." Then another. Don't call the cops again. We know where you work. The last message hit her like a physical blow. The community college where she taught Introduction to Criminal Justice twice a week. They'd been stalking her, building a profile, just like she used to do with high-value targets in places where the rules were written in blood. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed she was helpless. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. First, she accessed the property records for every house within a 3-block radius, cross-referencing recent sales with university enrollment records. Then she hacked into the college's student database, Child's Play compared to the encrypted military networks she used to navigate, and started matching faces to names. 20 minutes later, she had them. Brandon Kellerman, 21, junior at State University. Daddy owned 3 BMW dealerships across the county. Ryan Torch Morrison, 20, sophomore, trust fund baby whose mother sat on the city council. Marcus Tank Williams, 22, senior, football scholarship, already on academic probation. Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a pleasant expression. She opened a new browser window and began researching each of them with the thoroughness that had once made her the Pentagon's go-to specialist for extracting information from unwilling subjects. Social media profiles, academic records, family, connections, financial data, the digital footprints they'd carelessly scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs. Brandon's father was having an affair with his secretary. The evidence was scattered across hotel receipts and credit card statements that weren't as private as he thought. Ryan's trust fund was contingent on maintaining a clean criminal record, a stipulation his grandmother had insisted on after his older brother's drug conviction. Marcus's scholarship depended on keeping his GPA above 2.5. His current average, according to the registrar's database she'd slipped into like smoke through a keyhole, was 2.52. Outside, they were getting louder, more reckless. Alpha was trying to climb the fence to retrieve a beer that had fallen into her neighbor's yard. Ink was taking pictures of himself with her garden gnomes arranged in obscene positions. Flame was live streaming everything, narrating their epic pool party at the crazy lady's house. Sarah closed the laptop and walked back to the window. They were still performing for their invisible audience, high on the thrill of violation and the certainty of their own invincibility. She remembered feeling that way once, 23 years old and fresh out of officer candidate school, convinced that her training and her righteousness made her untouchable. It had taken 3 IEDs and a sniper's bullet to teach her that everyone bleeds the same color. These boys were about to learn that lesson too. Sarah picked up her phone and began making calls. Not to the police. They'd had their chance. These calls went to different numbers, people who owed her favors from the old days, specialists who understood that some problems required unconventional solutions. Martinez Security Consulting, a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Tommy, it's Sarah. I need a favor. A pause. Jesus, Chen. Thought you were out of the game for good. I am. This is personal. Personal how? Sarah watched Alpha cannonball into her pool, sending chlorinated water splashing across her deck furniture. The kind where 3 college kids are about to learn why you don't fuck with people, who have nothing left to lose. Tommy Martinez, no relation to the useless cop, had run black ops in 6 different countries before starting his private consulting firm. His laugh was like gravel in a cement mixer. What do you need? Surveillance equipment. The good stuff. I want to know what they eat for breakfast and what they dream about at night. Done. What else? Sarah's smile widened, showing teeth, like a predator catching the scent of wounded prey. I need you to help me remind some entitled brats that there are still consequences in this world. As if summoned by her words, Flame looked up from his phone and stared directly at her window again. This time, instead of waving, he raised his middle finger and held it there, his grin visible even from 50 feet away. Sarah raised her own hand to the glass. But instead of returning the gesture, she pressed her palm flat against the window and mouthed a single word. Soon. The boy's grin faltered. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Then Alpha called, out something crude about psycho bitches, and the moment passed. But Sarah had seen it. The crack in their armor, the first hint that they weren't as untouchable as they believed. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching them exactly how wrong they were. The surveillance equipment arrived at dawn, delivered by a nondescript van driven by a woman Sarah had never seen before. Professional courtesy. Tommy knew better than to show his face when plausible deniability was required. The boxes contained everything she'd requested: micro cameras the size of coat buttons, audio recording devices that could pick up whispered conversations from 200 yards, and a tablet that would give her access to every digital footprint the boys left behind. Sarah had spent the night preparing, her old training coming back like muscle memory. She'd drawn up operational profiles for each target, identified their vulnerabilities, and begun constructing what her CO in Kandahar used to call pressure point maps, detailed analyses of exactly where to apply force for maximum psychological impact. At 8 a.m., she was sitting in her Honda Civic across from Brandon's apartment complex, watching through high-powered binoculars as he stumbled out to his BMW, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The boy looked like hell. Bloodshot eyes, unsteady gait, the pallor of someone who'd spent the night drinking chlorinated water and cheap beer. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy, package delivered. "You sure about this, Chen?" Sarah typed back. "They made it personal when they threatened my workplace. Your call. Just remember, civilians don't bounce back like tangos. These kids break. They stay broken." Sarah pocketed the phone without responding. She'd weighed the risks, calculated the collateral damage. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to become something worse. Brandon's BMW pulled into the Starbucks drive-thru 3 blocks from campus. Sarah followed at a distance, her own car invisible in the morning traffic. She'd learned to tail targets in cities where a single mistake meant torture and death. Following a hungover college student to his caffeine fix was child's play. The first phase of her operation was simple: establish patterns, identify weaknesses, and begin the psychological conditioning that would make them doubt their own invincibility. She photographed Brandon's license plate, his coffee order, the exact time he arrived at each location. Data points that would become weapons when the time came. Her first strike came at 10:15 a.m. Brandon was in his introduction to business management class, sitting in the back row like the entitled slacker he was. Sarah had hacked the university's scheduling system the night before. Their cybersecurity was laughably inadequate compared to military networks. She knew exactly where he'd be, and when. The call came through the professor's desk phone, interrupting his lecture on supply chain management. Sarah had disguised her voice, adopting the officious tone of a university administrator. "Professor Williams, this is Dean Morrison's office. We need to speak with Brandon Kellerman immediately regarding a disciplinary matter." Brandon's head snapped up at the sound of his name. Around him, other students began to whisper and point. Sarah could see his face through the classroom window, confusion giving way to anxiety as he gathered his things and walked toward the door. She intercepted him in the hallway, still wearing the conservative blazer and badge she'd fabricated to pass as university staff. "Mr. Kellerman, I'm Dr. Sandra Chapman from Student Conduct. We need to discuss your activities last night." Brandon's eyes went wide. What activities? I was just studying." "Studying?" Sarah pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. "At 127 Maple Drive? Because we have video evidence that suggests otherwise." The color drained from Brandon's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah opened the folder, revealing printouts of his social media posts, screenshots of Ryan's livestream, and several high-resolution photographs of the 3 of them in her pool. She'd spent hours photoshopping them to look like official surveillance photos, complete with timestamps and case numbers. "Trespassing, vandalism, cyberstalking, and violation of the university's social media policy," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "Your father's BMW dealership sponsorship of the football team won't protect you from expulsion, Mr. Kellerman." Brandon's hands were shaking now. "Look, it was just a stupid prank. We didn't hurt anything." "Didn't hurt anything?" Sarah's voice rose just enough to make him flinch. You threatened a faculty member, Mr. Kellerman. You sent explicit messages. To a professor at this institution, that's grounds for criminal charges, not just disciplinary action. Faculty member? Brandon's voice cracked. We were just messing with some random lady. Sarah smiled, the expression cold and predatory. That random lady is Dr. Sarah Chen, adjunct professor in the Criminal Justice Department. She's also a decorated military veteran with connections to federal law enforcement. Did you really think your little games would go unnoticed? The lie came easily, dressed up in just enough truth to be believable. Sarah watched as Brandon processed this information, saw the exact moment when he realized the magnitude of his mistake. I need to call my dad. Your father can't help you with federal charges, Mr. Kellerman, but I might be able to if you're willing to cooperate. Brandon leaned forward, desperation replacing arrogance. What do you want? Information. Your accomplices' full names, addresses, and any evidence they might have of your activities. You provide that, and I'll recommend leniency in your case. Sarah pulled out a digital recorder, watching as Brandon's last vestiges of defiance crumbled. Within 10 minutes, she had everything she needed. Full confessions, detailed descriptions of their previous break-ins, and most importantly, the passwords to their social media accounts. What happens now? Brandon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now you go home, Mr. Kellerman. You don't contact your friends, you don't post on social media, and you certainly don't go anywhere near 127 Maple Drive. If you do exactly as I say, this might all disappear. If you don't... She let the threat hang in the air. Brandon nodded frantically and stumbled away, his swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of a thoroughly broken young man. Sarah waited until he was out of sight before allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. 1 down, 2 to go. Her phone rang. Tommy's voice was tight with concern. Chen, I'm monitoring campus security feeds. What the hell are you doing? Psychological warfare, phase 1 complete. Jesus, you know impersonating university officials is a felony, right? Only if they catch me, and they won't. What about the kid? He's going to figure out you're not faculty. Sarah was already walking toward her car, her mind racing ahead to the next phase of her operation. By the time he does, it won't matter. I'll have what I need. The second strike came at 2 p.m. Ryan Morrison was easier to track than Brandon, his trust fund baby. Lifestyle made him predictable. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., he hit the gym at the country club his family belonged to, the same club where his grandmother played bridge and his mother organized charity galas. Sarah had called ahead, using a voice modulation app to sound like Ryan's grandmother. The elderly woman's vocal patterns were easy to mimic. Sarah had spent an hour listening to recordings of her city council meetings, studying her inflection and speech patterns. Hello, this is Eleanor Morrison. I need to speak with my grandson. Ryan immediately. There's been a family emergency. The gym's front desk manager was appropriately concerned. Of course, Mrs. Morrison. I'll get him right away. Ryan appeared at the front desk 5 minutes later, still wearing his workout clothes, his face flushed with exertion and growing alarm. Grandma? He said into the phone. What's wrong? Is Mom okay? Sarah had prepared for this moment, studying recordings of Eleanor Morrison's voice until she could mimic it perfectly. Ryan, darling, I need you to come home immediately. There are some men here asking questions about you. What men? Police officers, dear. They're asking about some trouble you've been in. Something about breaking into someone's property. Sarah could hear Ryan's sharp intake of breath through the phone. Grandma, I can explain. You can explain when you get here. But Ryan, they mentioned something about your trust fund, about the behavior clause in your grandfather's will. Eleanor Morrison's voice was shaking with what sounded like genuine distress. They said if you're charged with any crimes... I'll be right there, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hung up and immediately called the Morrison family estate. The real Eleanor Morrison answered on the third ring. Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Rodriguez with the University Police. We're investigating reports of trespassing and vandalism involving your grandson, Ryan. We'll need to speak with him. Within the next 24 hours, or we'll have to issue a warrant. Another lie, but one that would create exactly the confusion Sarah needed. When Ryan arrived at his grandmother's house, he'd find a very angry elderly woman who'd just been told her grandson was a criminal. And when he tried to explain that she'd called him at the gym, she'd have no idea what he was talking about. The third strike was the most personal. Marcus Williams was at football practice, running drills with the casual arrogance of someone whose athletic ability had protected him from consequences his entire life. Sarah positioned herself in the bleachers, just another middle-aged woman watching practice, and waited for the perfect moment. It came during the water break, when Marcus was checking his phone and scrolling through social media. Sarah had spent the morning crafting the perfect message, using information she'd gathered from his academic records and Snuck. By 9 p.m., Sarah had transformed her backyard into a killing field of surveillance and psychological warfare. The micro cameras Tommy had provided were positioned at every conceivable angle, their feeds streaming directly to the tactical tablet she'd mounted in her kitchen. Motion sensors lined the fence perimeter, and she'd rigged speakers throughout the yard with audio equipment that could project sound with surgical precision. The boys would come tonight. She was certain of it. Fear made people predictable, and all three of them were drowning in it. They'd convinced themselves that returning to the scene of their crimes would prove they weren't intimidated, that whatever was happening to them was just coincidence. They'd need to reclaim their power, to transform their terror back into the entitled arrogance that had protected them their entire lives. Sarah had counted on this. She'd engineered their fear specifically to drive them toward this exact response. At 10:47 p.m., the perimeter alarms chimed softly on her tablet. 3 heat signatures approached the fence, moving with the exaggerated stealth of amateurs who'd learned everything they knew about infiltration from video games. They were early, sloppy, afraid, perfect. Sarah watched through the night vision cameras as they huddled outside her fence, whispering urgent conferences that her directional microphones picked up with crystal clarity. "Told you this was a bad idea," Marcus was saying, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "That woman, whoever she is, she's got connections. My coach pulled me aside after practice, said there were people asking questions about my extracurricular activities." "It's just mind games," Brandon insisted, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "Rich people trying to scare us with lawyers and shit. My dad deals with this kind of intimidation all the time." Ryan said nothing, but Sarah could see him checking his phone obsessively, probably looking for more threatening messages that would never come. Sometimes the most effective torture was the anticipation of pain that never arrived. "We go in, we prove we're not scared, we leave," Brandon continued. "She wants to play games? Fine, but we're not backing down." Sarah almost laughed. They still thought they were the predators in this equation. She activated the first phase of her counterattack as they climbed through the fence. The pool lights began to strobe in a disorienting pattern she'd learned from interrogation specialists in Guantanamo, just irregular enough to trigger anxiety without being obviously artificial. Simultaneously, she started playing audio through speakers hidden in the landscaping, whispered voices speaking their names, just loud enough to be heard but too quiet to be clearly understood. "Did you hear that?" Marcus froze halfway across the lawn, his head swiveling like a spooked deer. "Hear what?" But Brandon was looking around too now, his swagger beginning to crack. Sarah waited until they were clustered near the pool before triggering the next sequence. Every light in her house went out simultaneously, plunging the backyard into darkness save for the strobing pool lights. Then, through the speakers came the sound of her voice, distorted through electronic filters, until it was barely human. "Welcome back, boys." They spun around, searching for the source, but Sarah had positioned the speakers to create an omnidirectional effect. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Did you miss me? I've been thinking about you. All day." "This is fucked," Ryan whispered. "We need to leave. Now." But Sarah wasn't finished. She'd spent years learning how to break enemy combatants, how to strip away their psychological defenses until they were nothing but raw nerve endings begging for mercy. These pampered college students wouldn't last 5 minutes under a real interrogation, but she didn't need 5 minutes. She just needed them to understand what it felt like to be powerless. "You came into my home," her voice continued, echoing from multiple directions at once. "You violated my sanctuary. You threatened my livelihood. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" The pool lights suddenly blazed to full intensity, revealing what Sarah had spent the afternoon preparing. Floating in the water were 3 life-sized photographs printed on waterproof material, pictures of each boy sleeping in their own beds, taken through bedroom windows with telephoto lenses. The message was unmistakable. "I can reach you anywhere." Marcus let out a strangled cry. "Jesus Christ, she was in our fucking houses!" "Run," Brandon whispered, but his legs seemed frozen. "We need to run." Sarah activated the perimeter speakers, filling the yard with the sound of approaching footsteps, dozens of them converging from all directions. The boys clustered together in the center of the lawn, back to back, searching for threats that existed only in their minds. "You wanted to know who I am," Sarah's voice continued, now coming from speakers mounted in the trees above them. "Let me educate you." The pool lights cut out, plunging them into absolute darkness. Then, one by one, laser pointers began painting. Red dots on their chests, sniper sights as far as they knew, though Sarah was operating them manually from her kitchen window. "My name is Sarah Chen, former Captain, United States Army Military Intelligence. 20 years of active duty in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Iraq, and places your clearance level wouldn't allow you to know about." The red dots danced across their bodies, never staying in one place long enough for them to locate the source. "I've killed men for less than what you've done to me. I've buried secrets in unmarked graves and made problems disappear so completely that their own mothers forgot they ever existed. It was theater, psychological warfare designed to shatter their sense of reality. Sarah had never killed anyone outside of legitimate combat operations, had never buried secrets in literal graves. But these boys didn't know that, and fear made people willing to believe anything. "Please," Marcus called out, his voice cracking. "We're sorry. We'll pay for whatever we damaged. We'll never come back." "Sorry?" Sarah's laugh echoed from speakers throughout the yard. "You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you picked the wrong target. But you're not sorry for what you did." The laser sights converged on Brandon's forehead. He whimpered and raised his hands as if he could ward off a sniper's bullet with his palms. "I spent 2 decades learning how to hunt people who thought they were untouchable. Warlords with private armies, terrorist leaders with government protection, corrupt officials who believed their money made them invulnerable." Sarah paused, letting the silence stretch until she could hear their ragged breathing through the audio pickups. "What makes you think 3 spoiled children would be any challenge at all?" The speakers crackled with static, then fell silent. The laser dots disappeared. The yard was plunged into complete darkness and absolute quiet. For 30 seconds, the only sounds were their panicked breathing and whispered prayers. Then the pool lights blazed on again, and Sarah stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the yard. She wasn't hiding behind electronic tricks anymore. She was just a middle-aged woman in dark clothing, standing 50 feet away with her hands at her sides. But somehow, that was more terrifying than all the technological theater that had come before. "Run," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily across the still night air. They ran. Sarah watched them scramble over the fence like their lives depended on it, leaving behind shoes, phones, and what remained of their dignity. She'd achieved exactly what she'd intended, the complete psychological destruction of their sense of invincibility. But as she stood in her backyard, surrounded by the elaborate trap she'd constructed, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Emptiness. The rage that had sustained her for weeks was gone, replaced by a hollow satisfaction that felt more like grief than triumph. She'd proven her point, demonstrated that actions had consequences, shown 3 entitled boys that they weren't as untouchable as they'd believed. And yet, standing alone in her violated sanctuary, she realized that her victory was as hollow as their defeat. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "We get it okay? We fucked up. Just leave us alone, please." Then another. We're sorry about your husband? Sarah stared at the second message, her blood turning to ice. David's death wasn't public information. It wasn't in any database they could have accessed, wasn't mentioned in any of her official records, which meant they'd been digging deeper than she'd realized. Much deeper. A third message arrived. You want to play games? We can play games too. Then a photo. Sarah leaving the community college where she taught, taken earlier that day. The angle was wrong for a casual snapshot. This was surveillance photography, professional quality. Another photo. Her house, but taken from an impossible angle. Unless someone had been on her roof. The final message made her blood freeze. Your bedroom window has a nice view. Shame about the broken lock on your back door. Sarah spun around, her training kicking in as she scanned the shadows of her own backyard. The boys were gone, but they hadn't been working alone. Someone else was watching, someone with skills that matched her own. The pool lights flickered, once then went out completely. In the darkness, Sarah heard the soft click of her back door opening. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the prey. And whoever was coming for her had been planning this a lot longer than she'd been planning. A revenge. Sarah's hand moved to her hip and emotion burned into her muscle memory, but the Sig Sauer P226 wasn't there. For 20 years, that weight against her side had been as natural as breathing. Now, standing in her own backyard facing an unknown threat, she felt naked without it. The soft footsteps from inside her house moved with professional precision, heel-to-toe placement that minimized noise, careful weight distribution that avoided creaking floorboards. This wasn't some hired muscle the boys had scraped together. This was someone with serious training. Sarah activated the tactical tablet, switching to the interior cameras she'd installed throughout the house. The figure moving through her kitchen was tall, lean, dressed in dark tactical gear that screamed military or law enforcement. Most disturbing of all, he moved through her house like he'd been there before, avoiding the squeaky spots near the refrigerator and the loose board by the stairs with the familiarity of intimate knowledge. "Hello, Sarah." The voice came from behind her. She spun around to find a second figure emerging from the shadows near her garden shed. This one was smaller, female, with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that came from decades of command authority. "Do I know you?" Sarah asked, her mind racing through facial recognition patterns from her years in intelligence. The woman stepped into the pool light, and Sarah's blood went cold. Colonel Margaret Torres, her former commanding officer, the woman who'd signed the orders that ended Sarah's military career. "You always were too clever for your own good, Chen, and too impulsive. What the hell are you doing here, Margaret?" "Cleaning up your mess. Again." Torres gestured toward the house, where the first figure had positioned himself at the sliding glass door. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice when you started? Using military-grade surveillance equipment? When you began applying interrogation techniques on American civilians?" Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand the implications. "You've been watching me. We've been watching you since the day you left the service. A decorated intelligence officer with severe PTSD and a history of psychological breaks doesn't just disappear into civilian life without oversight." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "The boys weren't random." Torres smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Brandon Kellerman's father sells cars to half the Pentagon. Ryan Morrison's mother sits on the city council that approves federal contracts. Marcus Williams is being scouted by 3 different military academies. You're recruiting them." "We were. Past tense thanks to your little psychological warfare campaign. Do you have any idea how much damage control we're going to need after tonight?" Sarah felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had gotten her into trouble in Sarajevo. So this was all a test? My life, my peace, my fucking sanity, all of it was just some elaborate recruitment evaluation? Not a test. A rehabilitation program. Torres stepped closer, her voice taking on the patronizing tone Sarah remembered from a dozen debriefings. "You've been spiraling since David's death. Isolated, paranoid, jumping at shadows. We needed to see if you still had your edge, or if you'd become another casualty of the forever wars. By sicking 3 sociopaths on me? By giving you a problem that required your specific skill set to solve. And you did solve it, Sarah. Brilliantly, ruthlessly, just like the old days. The sliding door opened, and the first figure stepped onto the patio. In the better light, Sarah could see his face clearly now. Agent Rick Morrison, no relation to Ryan despite the shared surname. She'd worked with him on 3 different operations, trusted him with her life more times than she could count. "Hello, Sarah," he said quietly. "You look good." "Go fuck yourself, Rick." But even as she said it, Sarah was calculating angles, distances, escape routes. 2 trained operators, unknown weapons, familiar with her house and her capabilities. The odds weren't good. "We're not here to hurt you," Torres continued. "We're here to offer you a job." Sarah laughed, the sound harsh and bitter in the night air. "A job? After you manipulated me, violated my privacy, and destroyed what little peace I'd managed to build?" "The peace was an illusion, Sarah. You know that. You've been sleepwalking through life for 3 years, teaching introduction to criminal justice to kids who will never understand what real justice looks like. Volunteering at animal shelters because you can't stand the thought of anything else suffering the way you have." Each word hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "You miss it," Torres pressed. "The clarity, the purpose, the feeling that your skills matter, that you're making a difference instead of just marking time until death." "I miss David," Sarah said quietly. "I miss feeling safe in my own home. I miss not having to wonder if every stranger on the street is a potential threat. David wouldn't want you to waste your life grieving for him." The rage exploded out of Sarah like a dam bursting. "Don't you fucking dare! Don't you dare use his memory to justify this." She moved without conscious thought. 20 years of combat training taking over. The tactical tablet became a projectile, launched with enough force to shatter Rick's nose if he hadn't deflected it with reflexes honed by the same training that had shaped her. But Sarah was already moving, diving left toward the pool shed, where she'd stashed emergency supplies 3 years ago when paranoia was still stronger than grief. Her hand found the lockbox behind the pool chemicals, muscle memory guiding her fingers to the combination, even as Rick shouted orders, and Torres drew what looked like a tranquilizer gun. The Sig Sauer P226 felt like coming home. "Stand down, Sarah." Torres's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "We're not your enemies." "No?" Sarah kept the weapon trained on Torres while tracking Rick's position in her peripheral vision. "Then why did you spend weeks terrorizing me? Why turn my home into a psychological battlefield?" "Because we needed to know if you could still fight when cornered. If you could still think tactically under extreme stress. If you were still the woman who single-handedly extracted 6 hostages from a Taliban stronghold." Sarah's grip tightened on the pistol. The weight was familiar, comforting, but also dangerous. She could feel the old training taking over, the cold calculation that reduced human beings to threats to be neutralized. "You want to know if I can still fight?" Sarah's voice was deadly quiet. "Try me." Torres lowered her weapon slightly. "There's a situation developing in Southeast Asia. Corporate espionage with national security implications, American technology being stolen by state actors, our people being killed or disappeared. We need someone who can operate outside official channels, someone with your particular combination of skills and psychological profile." "My psychological profile?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You mean broken enough to do whatever you ask without asking inconvenient questions about morality or legality. I mean experienced enough to understand that sometimes the greater good requires individual sacrifice, that sometimes the only way to save lives is to take them." For a moment, Sarah wavered. The mission sounded like a dozen others she'd completed during her active duty years, complex, dangerous, necessary, the kind of work that gave meaning to the violence, that transformed killing from murder into service. Then she thought about the 3 boys who'd spent the evening running through her neighborhood in terror, their worldview shattered by an elaborate psychological operation designed to test her capabilities. She thought about the weeks of sleepless nights, the violation of her sanctuary, the systematic destruction of the peace she'd fought so hard to build. "No," she said simply. Torres raised an eyebrow. "No? I'm done. I'm done being your weapon, done being pointed at problems and told to make them disappear. I'm done sacrificing pieces of my soul for the greater good." "Sarah," I said no. Sarah's voice carried the finality of absolute decision. "You want to recruit someone? Find another broken soldier to manipulate. Leave me the hell alone." Torres and Rick exchanged a look that Sarah recognized from a dozen operations. They'd anticipated this response, planned for it. The question was what came next. "We can't do that, Sarah," Torres said softly. "You know too much about tonight's operation, about our recruitment methods, our capabilities, our personnel. So what are you going to do? Kill me?" "We're going to offer you a choice." Torres pulled out a small device that looked like a smartphone, but hummed with electronic activity. "Memory modification, selective amnesia. You forget tonight ever happened, forget the boys, forget this conversation. Go back to your quiet life teaching and volunteering, and we disappear from your world forever." Sarah stared at the device, understanding its implications immediately. Military research into memory manipulation had been ongoing for decades, though officially it didn't exist. "And if I refuse? Then you come work for us. Because the alternative, leaving you here with full knowledge of classified operations, isn't an option." Sarah looked around her backyard at the elaborate surveillance network she'd constructed, at the home she'd tried so hard to make into a sanctuary. She thought about David, about the life they'd planned together, about the woman she'd been before the wars changed her into something harder and colder. She thought about the 3 boys, probably still running, their entitled worldview shattered, but their essential